Okay, back to my introduction. Thank you for waiting quietly. So today's form part of the presentation, we've got Raith Anderson, who's the DBI's Managing Director. Raith is a registered architect with degrees in built environment, architecture and project management. Raith has been with DBI for over 20 years and the last 2 years as the Managing Director. He has a strong focus on project delivery. Raith has been involved in projects covering a broad spectrum from initiation through to handover. Raith has successfully completed large-scale developments both nationally and internationally, ranging in size from 5-star resorts, master planned communities and transit-orientated developments. Projects we're involved with locally is Wave on the Gold Coast, we've all seen that. Oracle on Broadbeach, currently working on the new W Hotel up in George Street. We'd love to get a presentation on that one day, we've been trying for a while. And currently working on an 89-storey tower on the Gold Coast. As the Managing Director of DBI, Raith is keen to ensure the reputation for excellence is upheld and expanded, and he's currently working on a series of exciting projects around the globe. Our second presenter today is Glenn Barton, who is former Arcadis structural lead on this project. Glenn is a structural engineer who's worked on projects Brisbane and the Gold Coast. He's currently about to lead a team of 20 on the Gold Coast. Over the past 22 years, Glenn has led design teams Sydney, Brisbane and the Gold Coast on projects ranging from $2 million to $550 million multi-residential towers. Glenn's experience ranges across all sectors, including residential, commercial, retail, hospitality and health facilities, and his largest tower is 80 stories tall. His breadth of experience provides a strong understanding of the construction process, and he's able to provide structural efficient solutions for all sorts of projects. So we'll invite Raith up first and then Glenn will join.
Okay, no worries. Okay. Thank you, John, for that. So DBI, we've been involved in this project since it was first amalgamated back in 2006 by Foresight Acquisitions. Along with being the architects, we're also the interior designers and landscape architects for the project. So when the site was first amalgamated is back in the pre-GFC days. So back then, the strategy for amalgamating key sites was basically just keep throwing money at it till people said yes. And ultimately the site ended up costing $125 million for a 11,534 square metre site. So it was about 11,000 square metres, $11,000 per square metre, which at the time for the Gold Coast was actually very high, but I think given some of the prices these days it's probably on the low end. The site is exactly kind of halfway between Surfers Paradise and Broadbeach. Surfers Paradise is kind of viewed internationally as being the more tourist-focused destination, whereas Broadbeach is more for us kind of locals, if you like. That's where we tend to want to be. And use that one. So the boundary between Surfers Paradise is Wharf Road, so Surfers Paradise precinct's to the north. Broadbeach is immediately to the south, so we were in the high-rise precinct. The site has 112 metre absolute beachfront land, so at the end of that amalgamation process, it is the largest piece of absolute beachfront land available on the Gold Coast. The region of this particular part of the high-rise spine, so those who know the Gold Coast, it's essentially right along the beach edge. There's this high-rise spine, and this part of the Gold Coast, I guess, had been neglected by developers for some time. As you can see, it's mostly kind of 3-storey walk-ups, some 7-storey buildings, 15 and kind of 25. The tallest building is actually Aquarius there, which is about 40 stories, but other than that is pretty old stock in this particular region and quite low rise. So the proximity of the site to New Light Rail Station, you've got Nerang River, you've got Nettie Harper Park there, and there's talk about being a future ferry terminal, so this would connect back up into Surfers Paradise, Broadwater, SeaWorld and run through there. Light Rail Station, we've got bus stops, you've got the main Gold Coast Highway, so it was seen as a good location in terms of connection and, as I said, halfway between two main precincts on the Gold Coast. So one of the most often heard complaints about the Gold Coast is its poor utilisation of beaches and respective facilities. And presently the only way that visitors and tourists can actually enjoy some food and a drink while actually being close to the beach is to actually go to one of our surf clubs. There's actually only 4 restaurants that are right on the beach on the entire coastline of the Gold Coast. So unlike when you go overseas, you know, resorts and that are right on the beach, that's not the case here. So Jewel was thought to be a significant step towards rectifying the situation. The initial concept was by Foresight Acquisitions, and it was a typical residential play. It was, you know, high-rise, all apartments at the higher end of town, some beach villas right on the front, but, you know, once again, it was intended to be, you know, high-level amenity, pools, spas, gymnasiums, that connection through to the beach. Then basically along came the GFC, and the developers struck some funding issues, and it was at this time that the Ridong Group from China purchased the site in mid-2010. Stephen Haggart was the then CEO of Ridong Group Australia, decided that they wanted to do an international design competition. So it was a selected competition, and the great thing for us was that we got to pick who we wanted to work with. So, you know, we sat down with Stephen and we worked out that, you know, it'd be great to work with Ken Yang from Llewellyn Davis Yang. He's probably one of the most respected architects in sustainable design within our profession. So they're based out of Singapore. Mark Barfield from London. They developed and designed the London Eye. That's probably their most known project. And then Chad Oppenheim from Oppenheim Architecture in Miami. So the Gold Coast, as people probably are aware, has always been referred to as Australia's version of Miami, with a similar climate, being a, you know, beachside tourist destination city. So we thought it made sense to see what, you know, the top architect in Miami was working on at the time. So when the guys came over, we got to basically give them a briefing of what we thought were the main influencing factors within the Gold Coast and the greater region. So the first element that we drew inspiration from was the geometric forms and kind of crystalline volcanic structures that underline the geology of the Gold Coast region. So this topography basically came from the result of the Mount Warning shield volcano. So, you know, this is actually one of the oldest volcanoes within the world. So that basically created the region that we live in. So some of it can be seen on all the headlands in New South Wales and the Gold Coast with these rocky kind of outcrops. So this is the Giant's Causeway in Fingal, and, you know, really kind of represents, you know, what we saw as, you know, some of the structure that we could take from nature. The second kind of influencing thought was the rainforest that actually surrounded our city. So between Tweed Shire and Gold Coast City, we actually have some of the, I think it's actually the largest amount of World Heritage listed parks and reserves anywhere in Australia. So we're basically trying to bring the rainforest back down to the beach. So these were some of the ideas that we kind of explained that we thought were key to this potential project. So Ken Yang's scheme, you know, basically we all went away, came back with ideas, and their scheme, not surprisingly, was very green focused, heavy on the sustainability, and, you know, they were literally trying to bring the rainforest back down to the beach. Single tower option, which, you know, perhaps may have been a bit too large for that particular scale of site. And then we had Mark's Barfield, and they had a different approach. They thought that they'd do a series of towers sitting within a landscape environment. And 3 smaller towers on the front, 2 taller towers at the back, with the bridge connection being, you know, for residence facilities, pools, restaurants and stuff like that. Out of the 3 architects, I guess Oppenheim Architecture seemed to perhaps have a clearer understanding of what we were trying to get to in the Gold Coast and the greater region. So for that reason, Oppenheim were chosen as the architects, and at the start of 2011 we started developing the concepts together. So this was one of their presentations that they put together. You can see that, you know, they're picking up on the geology, and the image to the right there's another one of Fingal. I really kind of like that one. They went a bit further afield, you know, picking up Blue Mountains and Victoria, but just trying to work with that and developing this idea of crystals. And you can see here how you have the taller crystal elements, and then you have smaller kind of crystals sitting at the base, and, you know, that later would form essentially part of the concept for Jewel. literally taking some of the rainforest. I really like this image. This is Natural Arch in Springbrook, where you've got the light and the water kind of coming down, and that was part of the inspiration for our Porticashore and our arrival experience. So over a 3-month period, we basically explored a lot of different options and how we might actually fit the buildings on the site and how they might work. It was actually quite an interesting process because we actually had 3 architects on the job. There was DBI, there's Oppenheim, and there's also our client Ridong, because Stephen Hagger was actually an architect by training, and as we know, once an architect, always an architect. So he basically set up residency in one of our boardrooms for 3 months, and he'd be working late into the night, would come in the next morning and go, oh, what about this idea? So this went on for a three-month period, but to his credit, he stayed true to the design direction, and at the end of it, I think we got a really highly resolved concept, even though it was earlier on. And this little image here, Chad Oppenheim, on one of his visits, he was touring around northern New South Wales, and he's down Mooloomba, and he found these 3 crystals, and they're have some local Aboriginal significance, and he purchased them, brought them back up, stuck them in the sand and took a photo and said, hey guys, this is what we've been talking about, this is it. And we all got quite excited about it. He got a 3D scan, and we started to put that into CAD and started playing around with it. And essentially, that's where we ended up with Jewel. So these were the first concepts produced. As I said, very heavily influenced by trying to bring this green back to the beach. Water connections, obviously, 3 towers so that you got enough separation on the site, and you could orientate the buildings, maximise views, and I guess probably help reduce the scale a bit. So, as well as being, sophisticated, world-leading architecture, which is where we're trying to go with this project, we made sure we involved, highly accredited international architects. The building was also going to contain a lot of ESD initiatives and many materials that would be innovations for, this region. So the project sought to create a welcoming, publicly accessible destination beachfront, something that, as I said previously, was lacking on the Gold Coast. So the only other beachfront development, as John mentioned, was actually the Sheraton, which was done back in the 1980s, but that's actually set back behind the sand dunes, so it's actually lost that connectivity to the beach, whereas here we've got that opportunity to open it up. So the other great kind of exciting thing was that there'd been very few new hotels built on the Gold Coast for some time. So the opportunity to work on the first new 5-star hotel with all the accompanying facilities such as conference facilities, weddings, mix of high quality restaurants and F&B outlets with a high international profile operator, which ended up being Wanda, we thought would lead to this project being recognised internationally. And that's exactly what's happened. It's quite amazing the impact of Wanda coming to the Gold Coast, coming to Australia it's actually had. We work in China, and when we go over there and we present our CV and they see Jewel, they go, oh, you're doing that for Wanda. And so everybody knows about it in China, and everybody kind of knows more of the Gold Coast in China and Australia because of it. And it's actually seen as one of Wanda's best projects. So that's actually quite good for everybody, I think. So this is that kind of natural arch image kind of going into the Porticashore. We ended up obviously changing that, but basically because it lost any connection through to the beach. But these are the first kind of ideas that we had. And basically we were on quite a tight time frame from the client to get the development application in. So the time difference between Australia and the Miami kind of wasn't working for the client, so they made the decision for us to basically, I guess, take over the project and so that they could get the DA in, which was a bit unfortunate. We actually enjoyed the process of working with Oppenheim, and we've actually collaborated on quite a few different projects over the years, and it's always great to see how other firms work and what they're working on. So before I start working through the plans, I thought I might throw out a few key statistics there. So the project value is sitting at just over $1 billion. There's approximately 95,000 square metres of GFA. There's 3 towers. The tower to the north is branded as the Luxury Tower, and it's 41 stories in height. The central tower is Hotel Tower down below, serviced apartments above, and that's the tallest at 47 stories. The 3rd tower sits right on the beach on the southeastern corner, and that's 34 stories on height. and that's branded as the premium tower, so that's seen as the highest end. There's 512 apartments in total, 169 hotel rooms, 3 podium levels which are mainly dedicated to hotels and facility uses, 4 food and beverage outlets, 5 retail tenancies, health and spa, gymnasium, conference centre, resort pools and bars. There's 3 levels of basement, plus a mezzanine plant level, which Glenn will talk about the construction of that, which was once again a bit different for the Gold Coast. 812 car parks. Is scheduled to have a soft opening of the hotel in September 2018, with the balance of the project to be completed in March 2019. So starting with the ground floor plan, get this pointer to work. There it is. So the main arrival is this central porte-cochere area. So it serves as a drop-off for the hotel, for the function facilities, and also Tower 1 lobby. So the idea is as soon as you arrive, you actually get this view through the landscape pool area out to the ocean, getting that connection, you know, green, green, blue, water, water. Council's very keen on activating the edges of any development, so that's why the retail was running around the perimeter. We also had a second kind of more discreet drop-off for the premium tower, Tower 3, with a secondary pedestrian access back through into the main pool. So the all-day dining restaurant we located at ground floor here, so you know it will be a fantastic location to have breakfast. You're sitting there with the sun coming up, and the public obviously will be able to get access into this facility as well. One of the community benefit things that we had to do, there's a surf life saving tower situated just outside the site. So when we've done the planning for Jewel, we've actually incorporated in basement level 1 some car parking, some storage lock-up for them to put their jet skis and paddle boards, a lounge area, showers, locker rooms. So that's going to be a good facility for the lifesavers. And then not only did we upgrade the street works in front of our site, we actually took Wharf Road all the way down to the Gold Coast Highway into Nettie Park. So once again, just reinforcing that it's an important connection link for the Gold Coast and this particular project. Up on level 2, we had the second level of the ballroom void, conference facilities. Over here we had the health and spa, gymnasium, an indoor pool and some back of house hotel facilities. The third level was the landscape deck area, so Tower 1, the luxury tower, they had their own private facilities, gymnasium, function room, cinema, and obviously direct access out to a second pool, kids' playground. The hotel tower, this is the first level of the hotel rooms, and then underneath the premium tower we had another restaurant going out onto the landscape deck. So once again you'll get that connection with that beach and it'll be a lovely place to have breakfast or dinner. So one of the underrated views actually of the Gold Coast is actually down southeast, because the beach actually goes down, wraps around to the corner, and you get views all the way down the coastline back to Coolangatta, and it's actually quite a nice aspect. So typical floor planning. So we ended up with central cores on this tower, and there are a number of reasons. So obviously with our shape, which is a series of different facets, where they're moving in and out as the building goes up. So we needed to try get some repetition in our floor plan so that every floor wasn't different. So the way we achieved this was through the use of balconies around the perimeter. So, we would get 6 to 8 levels, sometimes as much as 10 levels, which would standard before we'd had to modify the floor plate. The client was very big on efficiency too, so we had to rework this core and the length of corridors versus the amount of saleable area that they had. So, it was almost designing by numbers to some extent. We had to get to a minimum kind of level of efficiency. The apartments, so this is out of Tower 1, the luxury tower. The apartments are all quite large apartments, and once again, that was driven by saleable area and efficiency. This product wasn't going to be your typical Gold Coast product. As everyone's aware, it's kind of 15,000 to 16,000 a metre sale price, which once again for the Gold Coast is extremely high. I mean, it's still high for Brisbane as well. Nothing compared to Sydney. I think I've heard 40,000 a metre on some projects down there. So Tower 2 hotel. So this is a typical hotel level. Once again, same kind of concept of wrapping the rooms as best we could around, obviously with the hotel. Service lifts, back of house sitting on the back corner. And sitting above that are some service departments. So the idea of these, they'll probably go back into the letting pool. It's unlikely that with the purchasers buying these that they'll often be there, so they'll add to the hotel stock. The premium tower, these were larger again in terms of sizes of apartments. And this one here, while it's on the kind of back southeast, as I said, it's got actually great aspects down the coastline. Oops. Some of the just larger apartment designs. So these are higher end, all timber floors, obviously marble, etc. running through. Am I another? Thank you. Typical 3-bedroom apartment. As you can see, all the rooms are very generous. They've all, 2-3 bathrooms, powder rooms, large kitchens, higher end product. So these are the current renders for the project where we've ended up. So you can see that, there has been a level of rationalisation from the initial concept. Every big project goes through some value management. We just can't avoid it. But at the end of the day, we want to see projects built, so we're happy to be part of that process. But, we still, got different facets happening, and the idea there, they're going to reflect light differently, so you're going to get light and shadow, and hopefully help break up the building form. I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of facade types a bit later, but there was a reason for why you see what you do. The podium, the idea is it's smaller crystals as per those images. You can kind of see quite a high level of reflectivity there, and that was something that we actually wanted as well. We didn't actually want you to be looking completely into all these buildings. We wanted a bit higher level of reflection, and it's kind of 15% on the glazing for this building. So that's the smallest tower. It's probably not the flattering angle. I think it's the only angle where we actually look like we've got a square top. It's all these prisms and facets running through. Starting to see what's happening with the podium. So, the quality of the podium was very important to us because that's really what the public's going to see and be walking past. And there's a bit of stir since they've taken away some of the screening on the ground floor now, and people are actually getting a feel for the scale of this project. It's while it's 3-storey podium, it's probably equal to 5 levels in height. And, there's quite nice high volumes in the lobby spaces and the arrival porte cochere. So you can kind of see our copper. That's meant to have a bit of an earthy tone to it, so as if it's kind of coming out of the ground, you've got the landscaping around, and then you've got the cleaner crystals rising above. The porte cochere arrival experience, so a sculpture in the middle, and you can you'll get glimpses straight out through the ocean, so you'll be able to look through our pool area, look at the water and get that connection through. We can kind of see on a busy night when there's a function in the ballroom and guests are arriving in the 5-star hotel that hopefully this is going to have a real buzz about it. That's the main pool area, looking directly out to the ocean. There's the all-day dining restaurant. I said you're going to feel like you're right on the beach, and this will be the only facility of this type on the Gold Coast. So, typical view from an apartment. So, lobby spaces. We actually work very closely with Wanda, so they have their own design team in-house. So more so on the hotel, but basically they'd come up with a concept and then we'd have to interpret that concept into the Australian market and develop it further with appropriate materials, etc. But as you can see, we've got nice volumes within all the arrival spaces, good quality materials, hopefully giving that feeling of luxury to help sell it. Typical apartment, ensuite in the back. So you're maintaining views from the bathroom through the bedroom out to the ocean. So it's always important to have that connection. As soon as you walk into your apartment, you want to make sure you get that connection out to the ocean. Looking through the living area, one of the interesting things is going to be seeing the exostructure of the building actually coming from the inside. So depending what apartment you get, you're going to have different views and different kind of connections, which, sometimes marketing people go, we don't want any obstructions whatsoever. But, we think it's going to be quite interesting. And we've made sure that where we have connections, multiple connections coming together, that they occur at the slab level, so that at no point where you have kind of 6-7 connectors coming through in the middle of a lounge room view, that just won't happen. Through the kitchen, Said, you know, high-end appliances, timber floors, this New York marble is a feature. So we're working through, so as I said, you know, we're doing the interior design as well. We'll probably also end up doing the procurement for the project, which means that we'll design the furniture and get it made and source it and install it for the project. So this is one of the hotel guest rooms. So you can see that it's kind of getting a bit more lavish and probably a different style to what we used to hear in Australia, but remembering this is more for the international market. It's not just for the Australian market. And I think that's been something we've had to learn while working with Wanda and the Ridong Group for this project, that it's not about Australia or the Gold Coast market or the Brisbane market, it's about the international market, because that's where this thing's been sold to. Bathrooms. So a lot of use of stone. I mean, the Asian market, they don't like painted surfaces. They prefer to have a material, be it wallpaper, stone, timber panelling. Lot of corridors in the hotel. So some of the elevations from the early days. So the logic behind the facade system that we've got, originally we had three different types. So we had your standard kind of open balconies, which were intended to look northeast. So, you know, open views, not really, you know, susceptible too much to the strong winds. The predominant winds on the Gold Coast are the southeasterly winds. So that's where we've introduced this curtain wall. So it's you'll have a winter garden type effect. So your balconies will have windows up or open up. Initially they were folding up, now they're folding out. But they're actually to protect you from the strong southeasterlies, which, you know, occur probably 70-80% of times on the Gold Coast. So, whoops, too many. And then we did have a third type, which was on the back of the building, the western side, which was a breeze layer. It basically is a really deep solid element, which was a series of fins running up the western side to provide shade onto the building. So, you know, this has achieved a 5-star Green Star Design 2 certification. So we actually only got that about a week ago. So they're not going through with the full built 5-star, but we've got the 5-star rating for the Design 2, which is quite an achievement too. So I actually believe it's the largest 5-star design residential project in Australia at this point in time. So you can kind of see the different materials. The exostructure, these main elements running through, so they're a steel structure clad in an aluminium. The glazing, basically a grey tint glass with 15% reflectivity. The curtain walls are a double glazed system. I'm going for time. Let's speed up a little bit, not too far to go. One of the interesting things is that this facade is complex, and, you know, we probably don't want to do another building like this. It has been extremely challenging, but also interesting. The subcontractor for the facade basically said, look, we can't build this, you know. These connections that you're talking about and you just can't do it. Well, fortunately these days you've got Revit and 3D modelling, and we've got a 3D printer. So we printed out these connections, basically walked into a meeting, said, no, you can, look here, we've built it. So they then had to go away and work out how they could actually build it, and they have. So, you know, there's been a series of prototype meetings in China. We've had full-scale models, testing, etc. being done. So the first panels are actually going up on the facade on the lower levels at the moment. So their program, I think, is to try to get 20 up a week. I think they're only about 5 at the moment, but they're only just starting to get into a bit of a routine. The other thing we've had to play around a lot is the rooftops. So because the plant height sizes have been moving a bit, so, you know, with new technology these days, you get it printed out, go into council and say, look, we want to change the top of the building. This is what it did look like. This is what it looks like now. So the materials on the podium, as I said, it was important that it's kind of rich and earthy, and you've got the landscaping. It's basically a bronze copper aluminium panel. Fortunately, it's not a composite panel that is in the news at the moment. So it's actually aluminium. Then there's a gap on a frame and a compressed FC panel sitting behind that. I mean, one of the challenges we've got with this is to actually make sure that the first hailstorm that comes along this thing doesn't end up with a whole series of dimples, much like the access to one of the tunnels that we've got here in Brisbane at the moment. So, yeah, some bronze glazing on the upper levels, and clear glazing will actually occur on the bottom. So I guess one of the other interesting parts of this journey has been the approval process. So we started and submitted that package with council, which was in 2011. There were 14 objectives received during the advertising process. Basically, council didn't deem that any of those were worthy to hold up the project. So we received approval towards the end of 2012. Unfortunately, two objectors didn't particularly like that decision, so they appealed their approval in court. This, as we mentioned, was during the GFC, so the state government decided that, hey, this is a state significant project, it's an important city building project for the Gold Coast, so we're going to call it in. And then we had another 9-month process of working through with government to gain our approval. So by calling it in, basically what they did, they cut out the opportunity for those two objectors to actually appeal the project. So we ended up getting the project that we wanted. So Wanda came on board during this time when we were going through state government, and basically our client, Mr. Lee from Ridong, was looking for a joint venture partner, and the chairman from the Daly and Wanda group, Mr. Wang Jianling, during a visit to Australia and the Gold Coast looking at development opportunities, met with Mr. Lee, and they formed a partnership in 2014. We then went through another kind of process because Wanda always intended to be the operator for this project, always intended to retain all the retail F&B outlets, so they wanted their own stamp and branding on it all, and basically that's what's ended up with Jewel today. So I've got a quick little 2-minute just kind of series of construction photos just to kind of show you where it's at. Just before we hand over to Glenn. If you go up here to slideshow, oh there you go.
Talk through it.
It's just a series of construction photos basically taken every month as we started through. Glenn will talk about the sheet pile, which was different to what we used to. I tend to find these things interesting, but I am an architect, I guess. But to see how the project evolves over time. So we're going to keep this going throughout the period of construction for the project. I don't actually know the statistics, but some of these pools were huge, Glenn.
The tower rafts were 10 metres deep, 1,000 square metres.
Yeah.
So they were big pools.
They were huge pools that lasted for most of the day sometimes. So you can kind of see it in some of these images. You can kind of see how the builders taken over most of the beach then. I'm not quite sure how they got away with that either, because the beaches are pretty precious, but I think a good outcome that's going to happen out of this is when they clean it up, it'll be amazing how the levels will probably match what we want perfectly, so we maintain that connectivity to the beach and the ocean. There's one of the big pools. They said they were huge pools.
What level was it up to now?
So basically 8 and 10, throughout the podium. The towers are all different kind of levels. The hotel tower's up at the tallest. It's about 10 at the moment. So it's going to be ahead of schedule. As I said, they're trying to get a soft opening in September 2018. So it's such a key site. And, the design is such that it will stand out. Podium starting to kind of take shape there. And, that shot you had there, it will blend into the high-rise spine. I mean, ultimately, I'm not quite sure why we kind of so strict on height. Height always seems to be such an emotive issue, and, the market will often dictate it. But essentially, there's a section of coast where, in my view, you should be able to pretty much do whatever height you want. You don't want it everywhere, but if you can contain it, it really won't matter over time as the older buildings start getting demolished, and that's happening already. We're working on the Spirit project on the Gold Coast, where there was an old 17-storey tower that's been knocked down and been replaced with an 89-storey tower. Meriton's doing the same further up the coast, knocking down, I think it was about a 40-storey tower. They're going to be building with another, 90-storey tower. So, thank you for that. Hand you over to Glenn.
Thanks, Ray.
It's not on my screen.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Rafe. I'm going to probably not spend so much time talking overall about the project. I thought I'd just pick on a couple of probably interesting aspects around the structural engineering that we had to deal with on the project as we were going through it. Talk briefly around, just very briefly around the structural systems that are tied up with the building, and then go through some of the work we did on basements and how we worked some value engineering into that, some stuff around the foundations, and a bit of a talk around the construction. So as Rafe has said, buildings like this, they take a long time to actually turn into projects to become reality. So I started on this project around 2010, just before the international competition started. And we worked at that time on a number of different solutions to get through to the ministerial approval and getting the DA done. After they got the DA in place, Mr. Lee started talking to a number of Chinese companies overseas to look at trying to partner up to work with them. Ultimately, they worked with Wanda, but before that, they spoke to a number of state-owned companies. And one of them that was quite interesting in the process was a discussion they had with China Rail. China Rail develop a lot of steel and manufacture steel overseas. And at that time, the Chinese companies, similar to what they're going through now, it was difficult for them to export cash out of the country. They needed to do the export as materials and equipment. So we had a number of discussions with Mr. Lee, looking at alternatives and working with the steel. So we had a look at what we could do with the steel solution. The problem we had was that the DA was set, height of the building couldn't change, so we couldn't increase the height, and the floor to floors were already quite tight, so we couldn't introduce any reductions in the height in the floors. So we went through a process of looking at these elements, the asymmetric I-beams, with the precast, either the metal decking, metal sheeting going over the top, or looking at hollow core precast to form the floor slabs. So we worked up a solution with this. So we looked at an option of bringing steel in for the core as well, and framing the core up in steel. Went through the process, came up with solutions. We went through an exercise of looking at the steel solution, post-tension, convention reinforced, and some alternative precast options. And we put them together. We worked with one of the builders at the time to go through and do a pricing exercise. And interesting out of that, what they found was that there was probably the most economical solutions were the in-situ concrete and the post-tension concrete as the solutions. When they looked at the steel, they actually found that even though the China Rail were going to be supplying the steel, by the time they did the erection and transport the site, it was probably about the same cost as doing the in-situ concrete, and then you had to add the procurement of the steel on top of that. So we ended up with what's a fairly typical concrete structure for the building. In green is the core structure. So typically having a in situ concrete core reasonably central through the building, number of cells to the building which we linked with the link slabs through the corridors to stiffen them up, to join them together. Concrete columns, in situ concrete columns, and then in situ concrete slabs. And as Rafe talked about, we tried to work with DBI to come up with locations for the columns that could be pretty much consistent all the way up the building, and the shapes that were achieved on the outside generally done with increasing and decreasing the size of the balcony cantilevers. So we tried to keep it very simple. There were some areas where we had to have sloping columns, but generally pretty straightforward. So we took that design, generated up some lateral models to go through and understand the performance of the buildings, to understand how they would perform in the wind, looking at what we needed in terms of loading and the dynamic performance, what was happening. We worked through with CTB, who were the wind engineers. They generated up a wind a model to put in the wind tunnel. We ran it through, we gave them the information on the buildings, they ran it through the tunnel, gave us back the results, and we used that then to refine our design down further. So one of the things we did very early on as well was we wanted to try and eliminate the transfer in the building. It was a very costly exercise. So we went through a process and working with DBI and with the client to look at trying to run a column layout down through the podiums and into the basements. What we were finding was that made the basements very inefficient in terms of car parking. We started to have to look at going from 3-level basement up to a 4-level basement. And coming into issues there with the additional basement level, as Race was sort of alluding to, we were going quite deep and looking at what we had to do in terms of shoring. So typically on the Gold Coast, with a heavy gauge sheet, you're limited to about 12 metre length. A lot of it gets imported from China, and the sheet generally comes in a container. It's usually about 12 metre length. So typically on the Gold Coast, you have a 3-level basement, 3 to 4 metres at the first level, and then 3 metres below that gives you about a 12-metre basement. This one, going to 4 levels, we were looking at heading towards about 17, 18 metres of excavation. And we had issues in terms of the length of sheet that we needed to get in, the installation of the sheet. On the Gold Coast at the time, there was very limited equipment to install sheets beyond 12 metres length. We had concerns around the dewatering and the ability to actually dewater the site going that deep, and then the costs involved, one in extracting the volume of water that you needed to, and then the time frame that it'd have to run before you could turn that dewatering off. The costs associated with the uplift loads on the basement, with the hydrostatic pressures and how you actually, the piling or other means you needed to put in place to hold the basement down. So in the end, when we started working through all that, it was found to be much more economical to just introduce a transfer in the building and try to maximise the efficiency of the car parking in the basements. So we went through the process with DBI to look at where that transfer would go, and we ended up with that transfer being at the level 3 podium level. So at each tower, we then looked at trying to keep it reasonably consistent. So level 3 of each tower has got a 2 metre deep transfer. We did look at trying to put it into the podium level, taking it and putting it at ground level, but that was then going to have to push basements down further. So it was really an exercise in trying to minimise the amount of excavation work that we had to do on the site. So we went through a process, we came up with a solution, that got put through, DA was received. As Ray said, 2014, Wanda became involved in the project, they bought into it. And very early on, when Wanda got involved, we sat down and started looking at value engineering solutions. We met with Steve Haggart, and one of the things we found was the solution we had at that time was a 4-level basement, and that was driven by the efficiencies in the basement. And one of the things, Ray said, we've got 112 metres of ocean frontage on the site, fantastic, but one of the things you have to deal with on the Gold Coast is the oceanfront boulder wall. So in the 1970s, when they had the storms come through, it washed away the sand. The council decided that the whole way along the beachfront, they have to build, developers or whoever is developing the land has to put in place the oceanfront boulder wall. So we came in and had a look at that, and what they have is defined as an A-line, which is the leading edge of the front leading edge of the boulder wall up there. So that's the A-line. The A-line on our site pretty much ran along the boundary. So that under the conditions, you're not allowed to build any permanent structure within 8 metres of the A-line. So we had initially boundaries pushed, the basements pushed 8 metres back from the boundary so that we were clear of the A-wall, of the A-line and the boulder wall. When we started talking with Steve Haggart and with Wanda, we said, well, one of the things we could challenge here is whether we needed to build the basements 8 metres back, or could we build the basements underneath that boulder wall? So we had a look to see, the first thing we did was have a look to see whether there was any benefit in doing that. So we had a look at what could be achieved, worked with DBI, had a look at what they could do with the basement car parking, and found that 8 metres generated significant efficiency gains in the basements to the point where we could delete a whole basement. So we had the opportunity to delete the level 4 basement from the site. So savings in all those things before, the sheet piling, dewatering, excavation works. So the next stage, once we realised that there was opportunity there, we took that to the council. We had a number of meetings with council to talk through them what our proposal was and how we saw this being achieved, to get their endorsement for it. So they got on board, they agreed with what we proposed, agreed that it could be done. So we took that solution then to a coastal engineer who provided a report around the suitability of the system. And then we put that through SARA and got approval from SARA. So, as Rafe mentioned, he's not sure how they got access to all of the beachfront. A lot of it was around having to build that boulder wall at the front of the site. So this was some photos during the construction of where the boulder wall is coming through. If you go back, and we see that the basement's cut slightly into the gravel and the clay layers for the wall. That's what you're seeing there. Through here is where that section of there is where the basements come through and cuts into the face of that lower section of the wall. So these are pictures of the wall, the rock being put in place as the wall starts to get built. The other interesting part around this building was the foundations. So we did quite a lot of work in looking at how we could get the foundations for this site to work. So typically on the Gold Coast, the sites are sand. It's about 30 metres of sand of varying density, down to a layer of clay and gravel, and then onto the rock that's about 35 metres down. So we worked with a geotech engineer, and initially we wanted to try and get to a solution of just using raft slabs to support the building, which is not uncommon on the Gold Coast. We did quite a lot of work, initially some 2D work. We did some work with some analysis in 3D. We worked with a geotech, and we had a peer review and geotech engineer on the site as well on the project to go through looking at upper and lower bound values for the soil properties, so we could get an understanding of what performance might be for the tower. So we went through, did quite a lot of work. We analysed it. The initial ones without any piles underneath the rafts, we were getting up to 75 mils in the centre of the raft and about 15 to 20 mils deflection at the edges. So we looked at what we needed to do to try and stiffen up, particularly the centre of the raft. So we worked with the geotechs, putting piles underneath the areas where there was deflection on the rafts to try and bring that back up to where we wanted it to be. So the view there is a view from the Revit model that we put together that shows basically the piling solution that came in. The other issue we had was, as we said, the basement is hydrostatic, so there's quite a lot of uplift pressure on it. We needed to design a system to hold that down. So we used a series of tension piles underneath the podium areas to hold that down. The towers themselves had enough weight to hold the basement down. So towards the start of the project, we put together a DNC package for the piling. We came up with a design, we put it out to the market, got put out to the market. A DNC contractor came in, and they had probably a more or less conservative assessment of what the ground conditions were like, and they believed that they could get a higher value for skin friction for the piles that would provide a better hold down capacity. We went through a whole series of exercises with the geotechs to come to a solution. One of the issues we had on the site, which wasn't probably fully appreciated by the geotechs at the time, was some dirty sand, what they call dirty sand, which was, generally the sands are very clean. There was areas on the site where the sands had fines, quite a lot of fines amongst the matrix of the sand. So as we started going through and taking their approach on what the skin frictions were, we wanted testing to be done on the piles. So they set up a tension test on the pile, went through and did a test very early on with the piles, and found that the ones that were in that dirty area, the dirty sands, failed the tension test. So they pulled up before they achieved the capacity that was supposed to. So we then went back through a process of assessing what that meant, understanding a bit better what was happening, and redesigned the piles, introduced additional piles to provide the capacity. And interestingly, where we ended up in terms of the skin friction capacity was similar to where we'd been right at the start of the project. So we went through doing quite a lot of analysis on the rafts to come up with the designs and looking at the deflections, some of the plots of the work that we did with the geotech and the geotech analysis that they undertook, shown down the bottom there. So in 2015, Multiplex then came onto the site. So at that time, the site had been excavated. We had sheet piling in place. On the northern boundary, we had adjoining neighbouring properties, which we had been concerned about with vibration. So they had sheet piling to the west, to the south, to the east, and to the north we had a contiguous pile wall that was shotcreted over to provide the whole back of the stand. So that then formed the site. Multiplex walked on, piling was in place, and the rafts had been excavated down. So one of the first things we then worked through with Multiplex was the design and construction of the rafts. As we talked about, there's something like 2,000 cubic metres of concrete going into the rafts. The quite big pours had to be done in one pour. So we sat down, and one of the things we were concerned about here, the interesting thing here was controlling the heat of hydration that was going to occur with pours of this size. The concerns are that if the concrete becomes too hot, if the core of the concrete gets too hot, over 80 degrees, you will have issues longer term with expansion and cracking of the concrete. In the short term, if the differential between the temperature of the concrete and the core and the exterior gets too high, you'll get thermal cracking of the concrete as it starts to set. So we sat with Multiplex, worked with a concrete technologist to come up with a design of the mix that was going to limit the amount of heat that was going to be generated. And then we worked with Multiplex to come up with solutions for insulating the raft. So the intent there is that if we can control the heat in the mix, we keep the temperature down. If we insulate the raft all the way around, we'll limit the differential in thermals between the interior and the exterior of the concrete. So we did put quite a lot of work into it to come up with a solution in terms of the thermal and the insulation and the design of the mix. No, it's not very clear on the graph. In the end, the maximum temperature we got was up to around 55, 56 degrees across the rafts. We wanted to try and keep it under 70, which was good, so we achieved that. Maximum differential we wanted to achieve was less than 20 degrees, and generally we ended up with about 15. We did get up to about 20 in one of the rafts, but we maintained it underneath the limits that we'd set. So we were quite happy with the end results on that. So some of the photos of the pours, as Ray said, these were big pours. There's a lot of concrete. They started early in the morning with placing of the concrete and worked through the day to get the concrete in. Interesting, the biggest challenge on it is getting the concrete finished. Getting it placed, you could have it done, mostly by about midday, but you then need to let the concrete set and get the guys in to actually finish the concrete, which takes just about as long. I thought I'd just finish up and just throw up some of the photos that we had during the construction process. So here on the left this is where the seawall is. This was a step in the podium slab where the seawall comes up and finishes, going into the podium level, the podium 1 level. We've got the cores coming up, and the site, as Ray said, it was a very big site, 11,000 square metres. It was a big site. There was quite a lot of pours, and you saw the photos of that podium level with pools and planting and other things. There was quite a lot of steps and ups and downs going around through there that took quite a lot of detailing and work to get done. But it's all done now, and it's worked quite well. This one, the left-hand side here, you can see the slope in the podium. This is basement 1 level. So we have the slope of where the boulder wall had to go through in the basement level. Looking at Tower 2, that's looking across at the core for Tower 2, it was starting to go up. Wraith had some pictures up showing that porte cochere, which was, you know, fantastic, very, very nice views, tight in underneath the towers. Presented some challenges for us. Thought I'd show you these, which is the one on the left is the starting of a sloping column. So we had to rake one of the columns from the edge of the building back down to one of the internal columns. So that's starting to happen. And on the left-hand side there, on my left, is the sloping columns that we had to build and sloping walls that were part of the Tower 1 construction. So that was them starting to happen. As you go up, this is relatively recent, as of about a week ago, and you can start to see the podium areas and the sloping columns and the work that had to go into those to get the structure back into where it was, where it allowed that porte cochere structure to be built in. There's some more pictures just looking up from the towers, looking down onto the Tower 1, sloping columns and where that porte cochere is. So it's quite an interesting exercise to go through in detail. So thank you.